Turn in your Bibles, if you would, to James chapter 5. We've had a great study in the book of James over the last several weeks, and we're going to finish that up today. So our subtitle today for James chapter 5 is Life in Community, because that really is a thread that runs through the book. So let's talk about what we're going to cover. There we go. What we're going to cover today is we're going to cover some oppressive brothers. Well, we're starting right off on the positive note there. We're going to talk about being patient, positive, and persevering. We're going to talk about prayer, praise, and confession. We're going to talk about saving the wanderer. Those are our topics for today. So let's start reading in James chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire." You know, I get the greatest verses when I preach when the guy's out of town. It'll eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Okay, that's the beginning of the chapter. Now, you might read this chapter or read this part of the chapter and say, those are strange verses. Here's a rule of thumb as you read the Bible. If you read the Bible and you say, those are strange verses, 9 times out of 10, they are references back to Old Testament passages, and this is no exception. So let's talk about this a little bit. Oops, we have a new clicker, and I'm going the wrong direction. My wife tried to help me. She said, no, it's that arrow, and I'm pushing the wrong one. Okay, we'll get this right. Okay, who's being addressed in this passage when he's talking about these rich oppressors? You know, you ever think our church has problems? You ever get that thought in your mind as you look around the church? If you don't get that problem when you look around the church, you're probably not paying very close attention. And so you might think, you know, our church has problems, but this church seems like it has some real problems. Now, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure whether what he's addressing here is happening exclusively inside of the church or maybe in a larger community. But either way, it is a very difficult thing. And I think that he's probably talking about things that are going on inside the church. And so, you know, it's not a good situation that's going on in the church. There are some very strong warnings here. You know, in the first few verses, he talks about how he says, your wealth has rotted. Moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded, and the corrosion is going to testify against you and eat your flesh. Wow. You know, those are some heavy warnings. You know, you may recognize some of that language. Somebody was reading, I think Dave was reading in Matthew chapter 6 today. You remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6? Not to seek treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. It's the same idea. He's saying the stuff you have, the wealth you have isn't going to last. The moth's going to eat it. It's going to corrode. It's going to go away. You know, the word there, corroded, is actually in the text in Matthew chapter 6 in the Greek. And so it's an allusion back to Jesus' word. But more than that, you know, he's talking about seeking what we want through the flesh. The flesh isn't going to work for you. You know, that was Jesus' message in Matthew chapter 6. He says, don't store up treasures on earth. It isn't going to last, and it'll steal your heart. Store up treasure in heaven. James is telling these people exactly the same message, that the things that you're seeking in the flesh aren't going to satisfy you. In fact, they're going to corrode, and they're going to corrupt you in the process. He makes a reference to last days. We'll touch on that in just a minute. What was the specific crime that these people are guilty of? Look at verse 4. He says, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. Now that's oddly specific, isn't it? He says, look, you hired a guy to mow your field, and then you didn't pay him what you said you were going to pay him. That's what their crime is. Now, in case some brother volunteered to come over and cut your grass because you were having a busy week, I don't want you getting all worked up about that and feeling guilty all of a sudden and run across the room to pay him money. He's talking about people who hired people to do this job. These things were talked about in the Old Testament several times. In Leviticus chapter 19, in the original law, God told the Israelites, if you hire a laborer, make sure you pay him his wages before the sun goes down. They were in the wilderness for a while, and so the law was given a second time. That's what Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 4, God addresses the same thing. He says, look, if you hire a laborer, make sure you pay him before sundown, because they're poor and they need the money. Don't stiff them of their wages that you agreed to pay them. Okay, that's what the command is. I think what the passage that James is really alluding to here is Malachi chapter 3. If you look at Malachi chapter 3 in the first few verses, God says to the Israelites, I'm going to testify against you because of he names several things, but one of the things he mentions is because you didn't pay the workers the wages you said you were going to pay them. And so God lumps that in with some heavy-duty sins. And he says, I'm going to testify against you because you abused the workers. So that's the crime. Here's the thing. They knew this was wrong, yet they did it anyway. Why do we do that? Why do we do things that we know are wrong, that God has told us clearly, don't do that, or he tells us to do something? Why do we ignore God's command and do it the other way? Because we think that somehow we convince ourselves that it's going to work out for us to our advantage to disobey God. That's what happens. Look, this has been going on a long time. You remember the Garden of Eden? In the Garden of Eden, they had one rule. God said, don't eat from that tree. And so they're going along, everything's going well, life is good, and all of a sudden the serpent appears to Eve and says, you ought to eat some of this. And she says, oh no, God said we weren't supposed to eat from that tree. Now, so she knew, don't eat from that tree. And the serpent says, did he really say that? And then he points out that looks mighty good eating. And she looks at it and says, ooh, that does look desirable to eat. And she ate it. And then she gives it to Adam. There's a couple things I want you to notice in that. One is there's always somebody who is eager and ready to tell us that what God commanded isn't really important and our life will be better somehow if we ignore God's command and do it our own way. And so these people say, I'm going to ignore what God said, I'm not going to pay the workers, and I will have more money. Therefore, I will be happier and I will be satisfied. It didn't work out for them. It didn't work out so well for Eve either, by the way. Here's another interesting thing about the Garden of Eden story. The serpent didn't seek out Eve when she was with Adam. He sought out Eve when she was by herself. Community is important. Having each other around is helpful when we get told lies. You know, if you're on your own and Satan tells you your life will be better if you do this, you're much more susceptible than if you got a brother or sister around that can say, you know what I heard my life will be better, because that brother or sister will say, that's a lie. Your life won't be better. Community is important. So, you know what? Why do we do, you know, I have a feeling that there's not a lot of us who are going to leave here today, go home, hire somebody to mow our field, and then not pay them. Okay, so as far as practical application is concerned, that's probably, you know, there may be one or two of us who could do that. But for most of us, that's not a thing. But this isn't just limited to that. This goes on all the time. You know, God tells us that the sexual relationship is something that's intended between a man and a woman in marriage, and it's beautiful and wonderful in that context, but it's sinful otherwise. You know what? That has been destroyed at such a level that if you actually follow that today, you are thought of as weird. If you don't have sex before marriage, people look at you like you're strange. Betsy and I have been married 35 years. It'll be 36 in a few weeks, a few months. And even 5 years ago, when we went on our honeymoon, I was talking to the person that we were going to stay on our wedding night, and you know, I was asking her for all this stuff, and she was starting to get a little irritated with me because I was asking for so many things. And somewhere along the way, I said, "Look, I know I'm asking you for a lot." But, you know, we're an old-fashioned couple, and this is the first time we've ever been together, so I want it to be special. She got so excited. She said, "Oh, we don't get any like you anymore." And after that, she wasn't just doing what I asked for. She was dreaming stuff up because she was so excited that she had this oddball couple come into her hotel that had never been together before. The world tells you that's weird. God says, no, that's what's right, and that's the right way to do it. And if you don't do it that way, it's going to cause you problems. But see, we convince ourselves that that will satisfy us, but it doesn't. You know, that battle, at least as far as the world is concerned, has already been won. Now Satan's busy trying to normalize other things in the sexual realm that God never intended. If you look around, you see it going on every day. All kinds of things we're told are normal. You know, greed. Greed is normalized. Greed is held up. You know, the old movie line, greed is good. Jesus didn't think so. Jesus said greed is bad. But the world tells us greed is good, ambition is good. Get more. Get over on people. That's okay. You know, it's tax time. You know, the world tells you cheat on your taxes. If you get away with it, it's all right. That's not how Jesus looks at it. He said, pay your taxes. Thankfully, he didn't say you had to like it. But he did say to pay them. Stuff gets normalized. God says, don't have any other gods before me. The world offers us so many choices of things to put ahead of God. You know, sometimes it feels almost like you're standing in your closet trying to figure out what to wear when you want to think about what you're going to put first in your life instead of God. See, all of this stuff is Satan providing for us things that are against what God says that we get fooled into believing are going to satisfy us. And it doesn't work. Community is important. We've got to help each other out because we got a lot of people that are trying to work against us and Satan work against us to tell us these things are good. You know, it's interesting, the last days reference in the passage. The Malachi chapter 3 passage, it's in the middle of a passage that's talking about the coming of the Messiah, the last days. That's why that reference is in there, I believe. Okay, let's move on. He talks at the end about the innocent one and murder. You've murdered the innocent one who didn't oppose you. There's a couple of things that could be related to that. One is in John chapter 3, verse 15, he says, if you hate your brother, you're a murderer. We don't make that equivalency. We make a distinction between those things. God doesn't really do that so much. It also may be a reference to Jesus and that sort of thing. I want to tell you a story that this passage reminds me of. You may have heard this story before. It's called The Story of the Spoons. This is just an illustration. But the illustration is that a person was given a vision of heaven and hell. And they go to hell first. And when they go to hell first, there's this banquet table with all kinds of incredible food. It's just rich, delicious food. And the person is confused. They see all this food and all these people sitting around the table, and they think, well, that doesn't seem like that's what hell should be like. But then he notices that they're all trying to eat with spoons that have incredibly long handles. And so here they are in the midst of all this delicious food, and they can't get any of it in their mouth. And so for eternity, they're sitting there looking at a feast that they can't enjoy, and they're tortured by their inability to eat it. After that, the person's taken to heaven. Same table, same food, same spoons. But in heaven, they're taking their spoons and they're feeding each other. And they're enjoying companionship and enjoying a feast together because they're thinking about each other, not thinking about themselves. I think that's really the message of these first verses in James. Is don't be self-centered, don't be self-seeking, don't be abusive. Take care of each other instead of using and abusing each other, and things will go well for you. Okay, on to our second point. Patient, positive, and persevering. Doesn't that sound nice? How many of you in here want to be patient in your life? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Raise your hand. Man, almost the whole room wants to be patient. How many of you want to go through the things you have to go through to develop patience in your life? Where'd all the hands go? Okay. I understand, by the way. He says, be patient in verses 7 and 8. That can be the hardest part. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. He says, be patient. That's a difficult virtue. I often tell people when I'm sharing, look, there's two things I usually don't pray for, even though I value them. I usually don't pray for patience, and I usually don't pray for humility. It's not that I don't think they're good things, and it's not that I don't think God will answer them. It's just that I'm not sure that I want to go through what I have to go through when he answers them. But God will give them to me anyway as I need them. But patience is difficult. If you don't believe it, just ask a farmer. I grew up in farm country, and that's the illustration he uses. He says, look, the farmer plants, and he does his thing, but then he's just got to wait. There may be things you're doing along the way, but you've got to wait for the rains. You've got to wait for it to grow. If you plant the seed and dig it up to see how it's doing, you're not going to have much success as a farmer. It just doesn't work well. You've got to wait. A lot of times, we have to wait in our lives. I don't know about you, but patience is not a strong suit for me. I don't like it a lot. But we have to wait in life. It doesn't always go the way that we expect it to in the time that we expect it to. He talks about the Lord's coming. Sometimes we feel like, man, it's sure taken a long time for God to do his thing. In their case, they're when is the Lord coming back? Isn't he here yet? I think for a lot of us, we're glad he wasn't here when they thought he should come, because maybe we wouldn't have been born, or maybe we wouldn't have had time to respond. Be patient. He's coming. That's what he's telling us. The next thing he talks about is being positive. Verse 9. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Being positive is something that is really great, and it's not as common as it ought to be. There's a lot of people that grumble. If you've ever led an organization or been around people, even if you weren't leading, just being it, is your workplace just full of happy, positive people who are always saying good things about the company and saying good things about the boss and good things about the clients and good things about the circumstances in the office? If that's true for you, I'm happy for you. That's a rare thing. Don't ever leave that job, because you probably won't find another one like it. People tend to grumble. They tend to complain. They tend to dwell on the negative. That's just the nature of folks. And, grumbling, there's two things about grumbling. Grumbling is it's unattractive and it's sinful. It's remarkable how many commands there are in the Bible not to grumble or complain. All parents are familiar with those passages because we tell them to our children. We used to tell our kids that another word that was in the Greek was whining. That was also included in grumbling and complaining. You can't grumble and complain and whine. It's unattractive and it's sinful. But it's discouraging. One of the things that needs to happen in community is to be careful about how we speak. Read the book of Ephesians, chapter 4 and 5. It says, don't let unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. Only let what is useful and helpful for building other people up. Boy, those are challenging words to obey, aren't they? But we've got to do that as we live together in community. We need to be positive. I don't think we're ever going to be positive without some effort and thought and prayer. We're going to have to maintain vigilance over our attitude and resolve some things eternally to keep that positive attitude. But it's really important that we do that. Another thing is that he talks about judgment, the fact that judgment is going to follow a grumbler. If you're somebody who's a grumbler and you're negative, you're probably going to be judged by your fellow man, and you'll probably also be judged by God. That's what he's talking about there. So that's not something we want to have in our life. The next thing he talks about is perseverance. Oh, there I am pushing the wrong arrow again. I'll get this figured out eventually. I would say I like the old remote, but that might be like grumbling, and I don't want to do that. He also talks about the value of perseverance in verse 10 through 12. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or earth or anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Perseverance is valuable, but like patience that we talked about earlier, it's a great character trait, but I don't know that we like what we have to go through to develop it. Being tough is something that you got to go through hard things to get there. He gives the prophets as an example. Man, that's a high bar. Those guys went through some stuff. There's a study that I did several years back. I made a list of all my Bible heroes, or at least my top 20 Bible heroes. And so I wrote them all down on paper, and then I went and looked at their life. Now, these were people that I admired and I aspired to imitate in their character. But you know, when I read about their life, there wasn't one of them that I wanted to trade places with. Not a single one. Because they all went through hard things. And so, you know, sometimes it's funny. We go through hard stuff and we're struggling a little bit and we say, what's wrong? Why is this happening? Welcome to humanity. That's how it works. And especially if we're God's people, we're going to go through good stuff, or the hard stuff. Job isn't a much easier example. If you thought the prophets were tough, just read the book of Job. You know, everybody wants the last chapter of Job, but nobody wants all those other ones in the middle. We want the beginning and the end, but not the middle. That's not the way it works. Here's the thing that's really important, though. He says you got to keep your eyes on God. That's what makes it work. He says God's merciful. God's good. He's going to take care of us. But along the way, we've got to help remind each other of that. That's one of the values of community. We've got to be there for each other when we're going through those hard times. This church is a great church in terms of really supporting each other in that way. But we've got to do that more and more as we go along. People are going through hard things. We have to support each other and help each other keep our eyes on God so that we can persevere. You know, it's interesting. At the end of that passage, he talks about don't swear. What's that about? You know, why does he say don't swear? You know, when you take an oath, when you swear, what are you really doing? You're kind of doubling down. In one respect, you're doubling down on human effort. I'm going to do this. I swear it. He's trying to get us to look at God rather than our own effort and energy and our own power. You know, we don't really usually have the ability to do what people swear about anyway on our own. So he just says, just avoid that. Did I get two there? Okay. Next section. Let's pick up in verse 13. He says, is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Prayer, praise, and confession. The first point of this last section is that prayer matters. We should pray for ourselves, and we should pray for each other. I think sometimes, and I can be guilty of this, sometimes we minimize the value of prayer. You know, sometimes our speech betrays us. We say things like, well, all we can do is pray, you know, which kind of sounds like that doesn't amount to much. The scriptures have a very different idea about prayer. You know, prayer is powerful. In verse 13, he says, are you in trouble? Pray. In verse 14 and 15, he talks about how if you're sick, get people to pray for you. He specifically names the elders, but I mean, praying for each other as we have needs like that is important. In 17 and 18, he talks about Elijah. All of that is rooted in the idea of prayer. Prayer matters a lot, and we tend to undervalue it. Then he says we should rejoice in the happy times. In verse 13, he says, hey, are you happy? Sing songs, praise. Enjoy happy times. You know, so it's interesting. Sometimes I think that we don't attribute spirituality to happiness or to joy. And yet the scriptures talk about it all the time. Don't skip over the happy times. Look, you're not inherently more spiritual if you're sad and intense and focused. You're just as spiritual when you're happy and praising God and rejoicing. Now, you know, the thing is, be appropriate. Sometimes you should be praying. Sometimes you should be serious. But a lot of times we should be rejoicing. Both things are good. Both things are spiritual. Don't skip over happy. Look, if you're gonna learn to be patient and persevere and go through tough times, you better grab happy when it's there. Right. That's all I'm saying. It's not bad. Verse 16. He talks about confession as being a part of healing. You know, it's an interesting thing about confession. Confession's a hard thing for us. Have you noticed that? Have you ever known anybody to roll out of bed all excited and say, you know what, today's going to be a great day because I'm going to go confess sin? You probably never had that thought when you got out of bed in the morning. That conversation is usually a multi-part conversation where you tell yourself, I really need to talk to somebody about this, and you have to work up to it, if you're like me. But, you know, confession is something we have difficulty with sometimes. Why do we have difficulty with confession? I think one of the reasons that we have difficulty over confession is we feel like if I confess my sins, I'm going to give somebody else power over me. They're going to have the goods on me if I confess, and they'll be able to work that to their advantage and leverage me. Now, I will tell you that people being who they are, that may not be entirely unfounded, and it may actually happen. But that's not the real danger in the confession space. The real danger in the confession space is the stuff that we hide, that we keep inside, that we keep secret. That's the stuff that gives Satan leverage on us. You know, we should worry a lot less about the person we confess to having leverage over us and a lot more over Satan having power in our lives. If we get stuff out in the light and talk to each other about it and pray for each other and follow up with each other and help each other, we're going to have a lot more success in overcoming sin and getting things out of our character. That's good stuff. Don't be afraid of it. You know, James says, look, confess your sins and you'll get healed. You know, we probably have stuff in our life that we've been dealing with for a long time that we would like to get out of our life. He's telling us how to do it. He says, confess your sins, pray for each other, and healing will find you. The last thing he talks about in verse 19 through 20 is the idea of saving the wanderer. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Okay, so this is great stuff. Let's keep this simple, this last section. Point number 1, don't wander off. You know, that's good advice. Don't wander off. There's nothing good out there. You know that. That's why you're here to begin with, is you already were out there. You know what's out there. It's not good even though it's wrapped well. So don't wander off. It's not going to help your life. Point 2, what we wander off from is the truth. Don't wander off from the truth. But here's point 3. If somebody does wander off, go get them. You know, sometimes we get weird about this stuff. Well, they left. I'm just going to let them go. I'm going to ignore them. I'm going to not pay attention. That's not what James says. He says, look, if somebody wanders off, go get them. Bring them back. Now, are you going to have a 100% success rate? No. He doesn't say go get them and take rope with you and drag them back. They got to come willingly. They still get a say in the matter. So we're not always going to be able to bring them back. But he says, bring them back. It's a life and death issue. It can't be out of sight, out of mind as we live in community together. We've got to help each other. We're all going to have bad days. And we need our brothers and sisters to come get us if we get away from the truth and we wander off. It's important. Some closing questions as we look at what we've covered today in James. Number one, are we generous or self-seeking? Look, I'm not just talking about money. How do we live our life? A community where people take advantage of each other is not healthy. A community where people love each other and give to one another is healthy, and it sustains everyone in the community. So how are we doing in that area? Number two, are we patient? Are we praying? Are we willing to persevere? It's keeping our eyes on Jesus that makes that possible. And we've got to help each other in all of these things. Help each other in our patience. Help each other by praying for each other. Help each other to persevere through the difficult times. Help each other keep our eyes on Jesus. Number three, are we living in the light? Is confession a regular part of our life, and are we helping each other? Or do we live in secret and hide and cover? We're not going to get well that way. We need to be open and help each other. And lastly, are we helping each other stay in the truth and bringing back the wanderer? James talks in this last chapter about how important it is for us to help each other and to live in community together. It's a great book. I hope you've enjoyed our study of James. I hope this last chapter has been helpful to you. But let's have a great community where we're putting these words into practice and really keeping our eyes on Jesus. Amen.